Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by two guests. One of them is Daniel Glass. He is a clinician and researcher in the disciplines of evolutionary and clinical psychology. He has published 16 peer-reviewed scholarly articles in the fields of psychology, medicine, and evolutionary studies on subjects ranging from human emotions to peer bullying/victimization to Alzheimer's disease. He received his doctorate in clinical psychology from Suffolk University and is currently a postdoctoral fellow at a private practice in Connecticut. His dissertation is on the emotional processing function of dreaming. And we also have with us Niruban Balachandran. He was a winner of the World Bank's Innovation Challenge Prize and the International Society for Human Ethology's Linda Mealey Award. He is widely published in scholarly journals and print media and is a frequently invited speaker at international conferences. He is a Master of Public Administration, graduate of Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government, as well as a Bachelor of Psychology graduate from Rutgers. He was also a member of the Harvard Behavioral Insights Group, and they are both project co-leaders of PsychTable, and that's precisely why they are both here today to talk about that project. So, Daniel and Niruban, thank you a lot for you both for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for inviting me, Ricardo.
Okay, great. So I guess that in the episode I did with Glenn Gare, we've already talked a little bit about PsychTable, but just a little bit toward the end of the interview. And I invited you both today to explain it a little bit more and also for people to understand what it is about and what you want from it. So my first question would be the most basic of them, that is, what is PsychTable about?
So PsychTable is a taxonomy. It's a dynamic classification table which classifies the evolved psychological adaptations. Of course, we're focusing on these adaptations, or we call them EPAs, for humans. And an evolved psychological adaptation, more or less, it's a species-typical trait, usually behavioral or it's cognitive, that's been shaped by the process of evolution by selection. And we've classified it as such.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I mean, why did you decide to create this project? Why is it needed?
Well, we've seen the body of knowledge on the evolutionary behavioral sciences over the last several decades. And, even though evolutionary psychology is sort of viewed as a sort of new field, there's a number of other fields, of course, which have produced lots of research and lots of findings on evolved psychological adaptations for humans. Everything from evolutionary anthropology to behavioral ecology to behavioral genetics to social neuroscience and so on and so forth. But the literature tends to be quite balkanized across a number of countries and journals and research labs and so on and so forth. And given that there's just hundreds and thousands of these adaptations, we felt that it's necessary to be able to put them in a classification table inspired by, Mendeleev's periodic table of elements or Gray's anatomy for anatomy, so that the evolutionary behavioral sciences community can sort of drill down and research these adaptations in a very robust, informative, and educational way. And also the other reason why, of course, is because there's a need for improved open science as well. We want to open up the information about these adaptations to the general public and beyond scientists, students, faculty, researchers, so on and so forth as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and how would it work? I mean, you're talking about creating sort of a periodic table of evolved psychological adaptations, and we have the periodic table of elements in physics, for example, and their table is sort of organized by column and by line and things like that. I mean, would you have the same sort of thing in the PsychTable, or how would you build it, basically?
So PsychTable.org is an online collaborative project, and so people from the scientific community and from the evolutionary social sciences will all sort of come together to contribute to the information to the project. To start with, we do have a kind of a layout that is analogous to the periodic table, where we have some different groups of EPAs, which we could talk about later, different classes. But I think it's important to note that what we have now is sort of a first step, and because the table is dynamic, because it's created by the scientific community, it's likely to change in the future. And so that is to say that we have a general sense of how we could lay out the EPAs that we have in a graphical format. But I think one of the interesting things that having a computer-based, sort of online-based taxonomy will allow us to do is to represent the connection and the relationship among the EPAs in a different way than would be available on a two-dimensional piece of paper, for example. So I envision that a table, so to speak, could be a three-dimensional thing that you could explore via some sort of electronic interface, like a computer or a tablet. It could be hierarchical, right? Because as you know, the mechanisms of the brain tend to be nested in structure, right? With visual systems tending to be created of a bunch of different subsystems, and the visual systems feeding into higher level EPAs. So I think that there's a wide variety of things, and a very exciting variety of different ways you could arrange such a table in a way that shows the nested structure of the EPAs of the mind, and also gives some idea of how they're related to each other. It can be grouped meaningfully in some way, and I think that one of the hallmarks of the way PsychTable has been sort of conceived is that it is up to the scientific community, and we're very open to a lot of different ideas on how that should eventually be arranged, as opposed to the two of us, for example, saying, here's how it's going to be, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I understand. And I mean, we're talking about evolved psychological adaptations, but what are those adaptations about? And I mean, I know that you have different classes of EPAs, like, for example, EPAs that derive from natural selection, sexual selection, kin selection, and others. I mean, would you use any specific set of criteria to determine that something is a mental adaptation or not?
There's a number of different criteria by which these adaptations are classified or defined as adaptations. Special design, of course, is one of them. But if you look at Schmidt and Pilcher's paper from a couple years back about evaluating the evidence for psychological adaptation, what we find is that there's a number of different lines of evidence that can inform us to what extent a particular trait or a psychological, cognitive, or behavioral phenomenon might be an adaptation. So, for example, Schmidt and Pilcher in their paper, what they do is they find that, for example, if there's a number of different lines of evidence which are fulfilled, then it's more likely to be an adaptation. For example, if a psychological phenomenon shows up in, several dozen or even hundreds of cultures, for example, it points to its likely evolutionary roots. If an adaptation or psychological phenomenon comes online early in, for example, infancy, then it's more likely that there is a naturalistic basis to that as well. And then, of course, in hunter-gatherers, you see the same phenomenon as well. That's another line of evidence. So there's about 8 lines of evidence. If I'm not mistaken, it's everything from theoretical evidence to psychological evidence to medical evidence to hunter-gatherer, as I mentioned, to neurobiological evidence, to cross-species evidence as well. Do we see the same psychological phenomenon in primates, for example? There's a wariness around snakes that we see in humans, and of course, Stu Meinecke over in, I think, Northwestern, she found that the same phenomena activates in primates as well, pointing to its likely evolutionary roots, as opposed to, for example, a psychological phenomenon or phenomena that arose through learning or socialization or culture, or just genetic drift or other explanations for that as well. So to get back to your question as well, Ricardo, about the different classes, now the periodic table of elements, they classify the elements according to various criteria. There's different ways to slice and dice adaptations as well. You can slice and dice them by neurolocalization, for example, right? But we found that the simplest way to classify these adaptations are, as you mentioned, by natural selection, adaptations that probably rose through sexual selection, adaptations that arose through kin selection, inclusive fitness, and of course we have another sort of placeholder category, Ricardo, that is more or less the disputed or uncategorized category. So, for example, if there's a controversial psychological phenomenon where we're not sure which bucket it falls into, natural selection, sexual selection, kin selection, then it goes there first. Or, for example, a user who wants to propose a CPA puts it there first. And then, of course, the scientific community and the general public, or whoever is involved in PsychTable.org, they can debate the evidence and then eventually come to a consensus based on the algorithm that we'll be talking about in a bit, which evaluates the lines of evidence for that EPA. And then eventually, we hope, given the literature and other ways, to decide where that might go, which bucket that might go into on the classification table.
By the way, since you just referred to that, before we move on to other topics, let me just ask you, would it be the case that any kind of person would have access to PsychTable and would be able to propose, for example, an EPA and present evidence for it and even criticize EPAs proposed by other people, even if they are non-academics, for example?
Right, so there are a couple of levels of access that we foresee having at PsychTable. And the general access is one where certainly anybody can browse this website. We don't view this as something that's going to be behind a paywall or some sort of university subscription or something like that. We view it as an open tool for the public, and so anybody could certainly browse it, and anybody could certainly leave comments to make proposals about studies or EPAs that should be added, or criticize any of the science that's there. We got an open comment section. If somebody wants to actually contribute to the project by adding data, by adding citations of different literatures, or adding EPA taxa to the table themselves, as opposed to just commenting and making suggestions, then we want to make sure that they have some sort of credentials in the field, or in the universe of related fields that would be qualified to speak on this. So there is going to be an approval process, an application, an approval process that's very simply just submitting a CV and filling out probably a short form to demonstrate that there is some sort of research background or clinical background of some kind, or at least some sort of knowledge in the field that allows them to be qualified to to submit literature to show that this person is familiar with how empirical literature works and things like that. So there's going to be a process. We want to make sure that that it's not closed off to people who are not academics, but who have some level of expertise and experience in the field. So I would view that somebody like you would be able to become a curator for PsychTable, right? Based on the experience that you have. And so that's what we want to make sure of, that it's not Wikipedia, so that it's not every single person has equal access, but at the same time, every single person does have equal ability to view, browse, and learn.
Mm-hmm. So if it's to be sort of like Wikipedia, I mean, it's not the case that all people there can edit the articles as they please, but there are different levels of access. Is that correct?
Precisely.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So let me ask you now, because regarding the way by which the evidence will be weighted and evaluated, I mean, would there be any sort of algorithm or several algorithms working there, and would it be automatized in any way, or would it be always people doing or going through the process?
Sure. So I'll describe a little bit about how the site might work to answer that question. So imagine you are a student who was using the site. You could log into psychtable.org. You can browse the website. You could click on a particular EPA. Let's take an uncontroversial one. Let's take an EPA, for example, that most people, both within and without side of the evolutionary behavioral sciences, would agree that we probably are specially evolved to have, and that is the preference for sweet tastes, right? It's pretty clear that we have particular receptors on our tongues that receive a particular shape of molecule that in our evolved past reliably indicated the presence of beneficial calories, right? Sugars from fruits and from honey and stuff like that, right? So we have that particular receptor. We have the brain pathways that interpret that as pleasurable, and we have this system that goes out and seeks those foods. Now, it causes us problems in our current environment, but that's a separate issue. So we have that capacity, and that could be an EPA, and somebody could log on to that EPA, take a look at it, and look at all the evidence from the genetic evidence, the cross-cultural evidence, the phylogenetic evidence, that is the cross-species evidence, looking at the family tree of life to see what species have that particular preference for sweet foods. So they can look at all these things, and if that person happens to be a curator as well, they submitted their credentials to us, and we let them write. They have write access or contributory access. Then they can propose either to add studies to support the EPA, or the studies that they add, they put a citation, and that study could either support or challenge, or both, the existence of that EPA across the 8 different lines of evidence. So they submit that, and they put numbers, they put ratings. There is a system where they rate, okay, so this particular citation that you just put in, how strongly does it support the existence of this EPA in terms of medical evidence, for example? How much does it challenge the existence of that EPA along medical evidence, genetic evidence, and so forth? And they go through and they very quickly put in a series of ratings. So now you have one person who has contributed a rating to that citation for that EPA. This is the raw data upon which the PsychTable algorithm works. So if many people do that, you've now got a bunch of data that can be crunched to sort of spit out an algorithm that calculates all of these numbers and answers basically the question: how do researchers and clinicians and consumers of this research in the field view how compelling it speaks to the existence of this EPA? So with those numbers, there is an algorithm that basically it was specially designed to try to make sure that one individual doesn't have the ability to vote up or vote down an EPA all on his or her own. So across the different lines of evidence, we have ratings that basically show if it's highly rated along multiple lines of evidence, having what we call evidentiary breadth, that is a broad level of support across many lines of evidence, then the EPA gets an overall high score, right? Whereas if it doesn't have that much support, and or if it has a lot of different challenging scores, that is a lot of evidence that challenges the fact that this EPA is really an evolved specific psychological adaptation, then that EPA will get a lower score. Another element of the algorithm is the evidentiary depth. That is how strong are those studies that comprise the evidence for the EPA, right? In terms of sample size, in terms of the method, experimental methods that were used, if any, right? The study design, those sorts of things. Now, PsychTable cannot directly look at those metrics, but what it can do is it derives scores from the people who have rated the citations, right? And so with the evidentiary breadth and depth supporting each of these EPAs, they have a score, right? So the final product, the final PsychTable table, if you will, that it spits out, the graphical table, there are different ways that these EPAs can now be organized. They could be organized by, well, what's the most strongly supported EPAs in the human mind, all the way down to the ones that really don't have that much support at all. And we could also gate the EPAs that actually show up on the final table so that only ones above a particular threshold score show up, right? So the ones that have been proposed that really don't have that much evidence behind them at all, or that have been pretty firmly debunked even, don't show up on the table. Now they're there. You could still browse them. This is the recycle bin, if you will, the refuse pile of EPAs, and maybe they eventually go from the refuse pile up onto the table. But I want to make sure that that it's clear that not every single EPA that's submitted is going to automatically show up on like the final document. Here it is, right? This is to prevent abuse and to make sure that misleading science doesn't get represented as actual sort of well-supported science.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of how you will evaluate evidence and then decide if there's enough evidence or not to classify something as an evolved psychological adaptation, I mean, you said that you have the 8 lines of evidence, and I would imagine that, for example, if there were 10 studies for the genetic line of evidence, people would evaluate each of those studies, and if the results were solid, then that line would point toward it being an adaptation. But then you also have to evaluate the other 7 lines, and some of them could be weaker or stronger. I mean, and they would correlate in different ways with the final result, right? And I mean, would you give equal weight for the different lines of evidence? For example, would you give the equal weight to the genetic line and to the cross-cultural anthropological line, for example, or something like that?
It's a great question. Right now, the lines are equally weighted in the algorithm. We didn't see any theoretical reason why even genetic evidence, which some view as extremely hard science, right? That doesn't really tell us whether something is evolved for a particular purpose or not. But it is fairly compelling toward the idea that okay, there is something that is hereditary about this trait, for example. So right now the lines are equally weighted. However, if it turned out down the line that the scientific community involved in PsychTable were able to bring a compelling case to our team that said, you know what, theoretical evidence should be weighted less than phylogenetic evidence, for example, right? It would be a simple matter to change the math behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, I mean, in the end, you would have sort of a tree of correlations, let's say, like, for example, just to bring an example up, as people have in IQ research, because they do different tests and then each of them correlate differently with the IQ score. Would it work as something like that, or?
That would be interesting. So we haven't thought about that. So you're basically, doing a sort of, you could sort of do a factor analysis or some sort of model with loadings to show, for example, that things, EPAs that have high genetic and cross-cultural evidence tend to show up higher on the table as opposed to ones with maybe high, medical and the other thing. I think that's an interesting idea. That could be an interesting way to inform the weightings, basically, and I think that one of the things that excites us about the project is the ideas that people bring to us about how to mine the data in different ways that we haven't thought of, right? Different things that you could glean from the project that really never occurred to us.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that it would also be possible for people to study and do studies on how we should give different weights to different sources of evidence or not? I mean, using PsychTable for studying given the structure itself of the table?
I think it's worth exploring, and on top of that, what's great about the system is that, for example, if I'm a budding researcher or if I'm a student and I would like to investigate an EPA or propose an EPA fresh from the start, let's say, for example, I want to look at pregnancy sickness, which is an adaptation which protects the infant in the womb, right? Mothers in a particular trimester may experience these conditions biologically, physiologically, because it's a way of protecting the infant, right? Now, if I was a researcher interested in this, then I would go ahead and look at the lines of evidence in the literature, and I would score that EPA according to what I feel the literature says. So, for example, there's been a number of cross-cultural studies which show that pregnancy sickness shows up across a large number of countries. But also what's great about it is that it shows me, or it gives me an opportunity about the gaps in the research or the opportunities for future research. So, for example, if there's quite a bit of, hunter-gatherer research on pregnancy sickness that also shows up in these particular indigenous societies, but there's not enough behavioral genetics evidence of it, or no twin studies of it, for example, of that or any other psychological phenomenon, then that's great, because if I'm a researcher, I'm a student, and I'm very ambitious, and I want to look at ways for me to contribute to the literature, then I can go ahead and see where those gaps are, and I can go ahead and contribute by setting up experiments or other forms of research studies or mining data that already exists, or whatever it might be, to contribute to the body of knowledge that we have on pregnancy sickness or any other adaptation that we would like to investigate some more, as well as propose new EPAs which maybe are debatable, or some researchers have just found the most interesting phenomena without having much of a basis of it, right? These sort of automatic responses, for example, I believe there's been research that's been found that mothers in a particular trimester are able to recognize fear expressions better than those who are not in the trimester, or better than mothers, for example. So those are just some phenomena which can be put on the table, investigated more, debated on the site among the scientific community, as well as the general public and anyone else who'd like to join as well. So that's good for students in addition to that too.
And I think it's actually worth saying at this point that one of the criticisms of evolutionary psychology as a field per se is over-reliance on adaptationism. And I understand that criticism, and I think that one of the big things that PsychTable can solve is this this idea that the field is somehow relying solely on adaptationist explanations. PsychTable in itself is not does not favor adaptationist explanations of everything, right? And in fact, quite the opposite. The burden of proof is on somebody who believes that a trait is an adaptation in order to get it strongly supported. And that's why my prediction is when we start adding data to the table, that the the ones that are going to come out highest are going to be the ones that most people agree in the biological sciences and outside of it are adaptations. Thirst, for example, preference for sweet foods, aversion to bitter foods, like those sorts of things. Color vision, right? The ones that are not controversial. The ones that are a little more controversial outside of evolutionary psychology, for example. Let's say the preference, the male preference for youth and fertility in females, right? This is one that, I would say maybe 80 to 90% of evolutionary psychologists per se sort of would not find that to be a controversial statement, but people outside of the field and including a lot of biologists would take issue with that if you just posited that is a adaptation and that is an evolved trait in humans. Okay, fine. Now, whether the people on the team have individual positions on that or not is really irrelevant, because the system itself is agnostic. PsychTable itself is agnostic as to whether or not that's an adaptation. You support it with data. You challenge that with data, and then whatever comes out comes out. And so I think that it's notable that one of our supporters is David Bowler, who a few years ago was pretty well known in the evolutionary sciences. He's a philosopher of science. He was well known in evolutionary psychology for having a pretty blistering critique of some of the methods that evolutionary psychology used, and he liked the idea of PsychTable because there's no real, as he called it, programmatic agenda to try to support adaptationist explanations, right? The idea really is that we separate the wheat from the chaff here, and even our pet favorite explanations. We love certain evolutionary adaptations. If they're not supported on the table, they don't get on the table. And you know what? That's what science is about, is letting go of your dearly held beliefs. So that's okay with us.
Mm-hmm. Great. So let's explore that criticism a little bit more, because it's very interesting. Are you willing or thinking about including, for example, cultural adaptations or group level adaptations, or are you just considering genetic adaptations and the ones that occur at an individual level?
It's a great question, and we get that a lot. And so there's sort of two different questions in there. One of them is about group level adaptations. Mm-hmm. The PsychTable really operates on an individual level, but it does capture group adaptations in the sense that any adaptation that works on the level of a human group has to be instantiated on the individual level as well, right, in order to work. And so from that perspective, if there is a group level adaptation such as religious belief, for example, right, it doesn't really work without each individual within the group having some sort of predisposition to behave in that way, right? So that's how PsychTable captures those sorts of things that are what we call genetic adaptations. The cultural adaptation one is another issue. It's a very interesting topic for me personally. It's not quite captured through PsychTable in that it's PsychTable has a particular remit, which is to sort of look at the if you will, the genetic adaptations of the human mind, sort of the things that the human mind is evolved to develop over the course of the lifetime. Cultural adaptations are, one of the things about them is they can be virtually unbounded, right? As long as they fit within the paradigm of biological evolution, right? There's a lot of different routes it can take, and I think that to the extent that cultural adaptations are often bound by our biological adaptations, PsychTable does speak to that indirectly, right? But certainly, if you could think of a particular cultural adaptation, for example, if you were to say that religion is a purely cultural adaptation and that we do not have any, evolved biological predisposition to belief. Now, I don't necessarily believe that's the case. I think that a lot of scientists would say that we do have some of the elements of religion are born out of biological adaptations that we have. Right? But if you didn't believe that, if you believed it was purely cultural, then PsychTable would not be able to capture that.
Mm-hmm. So, I also asked you that because this is a very interesting and contentious question. Even in biology and philosophy of biology, people still discuss the levels of selection that exist, or at what level selection occurs. And I mean, if people think that, for example, natural selection occurs at the individual level, then if there are group traits, then they might say that those traits are sub-products of those adaptations, but we can't really have adaptations occurring at a group level. But then when we get into issues about group selection, then it seems to me, because of the interviews I've been having with several different evolutionary biologists and so on, that people are more willing to accept the idea of a cultural group selection. I mean, genetic group selection. Only a few people like David Sloan Wilson, Neo Wilson, and two or three more people agree with that. But when it comes to cultural group selection, people are more open to it, and maybe at that level we could have some cultural adaptations. I don't know.
Right, and I think two things. I think that there is room for perhaps having some of the more popular cultural adaptations to be, mentioned somehow on the table. For example, if it turns out that religion were a purely cultural adaptation that were underlied by particular EPAs, I don't think that it's impossible that PsychTable could eventually, address that in some way. Right? Here are some of the EPAs that underlie some of the more commonly seen cultural adaptations. But the other to address the controversy, which is a very important one in the field right now, I believe that PsychTable is somewhat agnostic on whether or not the behaviors that David Sloan Wilson calls group selection should be called group selection or not, right? So if you look at the debate, most of it, the way I understand it, is basically it's a terminological one. Basically, David Sloan Wilson would say it's a little more than that, but somebody like Richard Dawkins would say, okay, I agree with what you're saying could happen in theory, but we should not call a group selection. That's misleading. At least that was his position around 8 or 9 years ago when I was really following the debate. It's a special case of individual or kin selection, basically, right? And David Sloan Wilson would say, no, there's something more than that, even when you're talking on the biological level. I do think that let's take one that another one that I know about, which is altruism, right? Altruism has been sometimes suggested to work on a group level as well as the individual. Again, I'm not taking a strong position on this, but if one sort of group selection argument could be something like groups with particular frequencies of an altruistic trait can do better than groups with a different frequency of that trait, right? Even sort of leaving aside the individual, whether or not the individuals are related, right? That's one version of that argument, and I still think that in that version of the argument, there is still room to have on PsychTable, basically, well, altruism, whether or not it works on the group or individual level, is still an individual level trait, and the claim is not being made that it only shows up in the group, but rather that in particular frequencies within groups can have this group level selection effect. So if you see the distinction I'm making, it's not that is not an example of a claim that only shows up in a group. Now, I'm not sure if there are any anybody who's claiming that there are certain like biological adaptations that only show up on the group level and not at all on the individual. But if there were, and if that were well supported, then PsychTable should be equipped to handle that. Right now, it's that's not how we conceived it. But again, we are open to the scientific community because this is a tool of the scientific community.
Mm-hmm. Sure. The platform is equipped, for example, when we're describing a phenomenon and we're debating to what extent it's an EPA, whether it's at the group level or the gene level or whichever level is sort of described in multi-level selection theory, as Martin Nowak and E.O. Wilson and David Sloan Wilson talk about. In the end, folks have to fill out the dossier or the profile of each EPA. And that includes things such as filling in, for example, the neurolocalization. Where is it in the brain? Where does it usually tend to appear neurophysiologically, right? And then they also have to, fill in things such as, to what extent does it actually enhance fitness, right? And at what level, right? So also, is there low phenotypic variance? Is there low genotypic variance of that particular phenomenon as well? And as Dan correctly said as well, the thing is, if the phenomenon, for example, is, let's say, religion or moral judgment or musicophilia, the love of music appears in almost every single culture. It's a near universal, if not a universal. Then deciding, to what extent that should appear on the table, in my view, it can and should appear on the table. It can and should be debated, ideally in the uncategorized or disputed bucket first. And the level of selection comes down to the scientific community and the general public and folks who are using the classification table. That's just what it's all about. Supporting and challenging the evidence and having a robust discussion about it, rather than a lot of the back and forth which happens these days. I think it is a good way to, right? Is a good way to convene various perspectives around those different phenomena.
And Ricardo, just a small point in case any of the listeners are hung up on the idea of neurolocalization that Niruban mentioned. I just want to preempt the argument which we know that EPAs are not necessarily all specifically neurolocalized in the way that a phrenologist might say, right? But the idea that the PsychTable is going to be able to support discussion of the different pathways that are involved, right? If there are particular regions that are involved, right? So it was a minor point, but it's something that comes up a lot in the literature to say, well, EPAs. The strong version of this argument would be EPAs cannot exist because we cannot localize them. That's really, nobody's really making it that strong of a claim, but it certainly is a problem for localizationist ideas. If you say, oh, where's the cheater detection area of the brain, right? And we know that that's not true. And we wanted to make sure that nobody was really writing off PsychTable because they heard about neurolocalization, right? So it's a more fluid and sort of dynamic idea of pathways.
Right. And it's only one line of evidence too. Yeah.
Yeah, and that bit about neurolocalization, it's very interesting, and let me ask you a question about that, because in evolutionary psychology we have this big idea about the massive modularity of the human mind, or the mind in general, right? And I mean, that's another contentious topic, because from the very beginning, people like Lida Cosmides and John Tooby and Steven Pinker have been pushing for the idea that we have, our minds are basically composed of hundreds or thousands or whatever different cognitive modules that are domain specific. But then there are people that question that and say that maybe that's not the case. Maybe we have at least some domain general cognitive mechanisms that are also evolved. So do you think that by tackling this issue about the evolutionary psychological adaptations, that it could also help us shed new light on that topic, or not?
Well, the thing is, a lot of folks have been using in the past, maybe about 1 or 2 decades ago, I started seeing in the literature quite a bit EPM, evolved psychological mechanism or module, for example. And that's why we use the word EPA. Because, as an adaptation, we're referring to phenomena which are cognitive, behavioral, emotional, which may or may not be modular. Let's put it that way. It's given within biology that whether it's primates or other species, adaptations exist, whether they're arose by natural sexual kin selection, whichever, mechanism. And the thing is, can it help resolve the debate? I'm not exactly sure it'll help solve the problem right away, of course. But does it bring up important questions about, for example, the quality of research in the field and the philosophy of science behind it as well? Yes, I do think that that does contribute to that particular discussion.
Okay, but maybe not aid us in distinguishing between a domain specific or a domain general module.
Well, here's how I think about it. I think about PsychTable as eventually being able to speak directly to that issue, and here's why. So just to get into the weeds of the term module, I think might go over some listeners' heads, but some might be interested in this idea that, Jerry Fodor, the philosopher, came up with the idea of what a module is, and then a lot of people in the evolutionary behavioral sciences kind of ran with this idea. Yes, this sort of encapsulates basically what they were thinking that an EPA should really be like. It should be modular. Then there was some backlash where a lot of people would first, as you sort of said, no, maybe not everything is modular. Maybe some things are modular, but not everything. Maybe very few things are modular. And then other people started to say, well, if you use the term module, then it has to have these particular theoretical commitments and these particular characteristics, and the things in the EPAs that we see in the brain don't have those. And then people like Rob Kurzban and Barrett Clark came back and said, no, a module doesn't have to have those things, right? A module, and then they define module a little more closely to how we're defining EPA in a little more of a general sense. A module does this, and the other thing. So what I'm saying is there's this thorny debate about the use of the term module, and so we decided to sidestep that entirely when we made the table. And the most that we ever use the term is on our frequently asked questions. Are EPAs the same as modules? And we basically say an EPA, a module, is something that some people use to describe EPAs. We don't use the term because we want to sidestep that entirely. And some people think that a module is an EPA with particular characteristics that they may or may not have. Having said that, right, to say that we have an EPA for a specific thing, to say we have an EPA for, let's say, cheater detection, right, if that did become highly supported on the table through the process that we use to aggregate and rate the literature, then that would be the same as saying, well, it turns out that we do have this mechanism that is specifically evolved for this. If that does not come out as strongly supported, then that is to say we don't currently have evidence that we are specifically evolved to detect social cheaters, right? So that's part of what is wrapped up in the evidentiary ratings and scores, is that the literature is speaking to the fact that we have specifically evolved this particular trait for this particular reason. So you can see how this could speak directly eventually to this issue of how many modules do we have, right? Is it many or is it few, right? If it turns out that we have a whole lot of EPAs that are strongly supported, then oh look, we might have this number of modules, maybe more. But again, we're not using that term. If people people who like that term like to look at the table and say, see, then that's great. At the same time, having a domain general mechanism that actually takes care of a lot of different behaviors that some people like to call individual modules, well, that's also an EPA, right? So if we have a domain general mechanism to do a whole range of social behaviors, which some people have counter-proposed, then that in and of itself is an EPA, right? We have to have a general domain evolved psychological adaptation to do that, because doing that is a very different sort of thing than being able to detect free-floating molecules in the air, and that's why the sense of smell does not really capture the same thing as the social and mating domain, right? So I don't think that most serious evolutionary behavioral scientists or social scientists would say that we have a domain general for everything, right? But that we have them for particular things, and if that's the case, that's in and of itself an EPA, and that should be on the table as well.
Okay, excellent. So let me just ask you one last question. You've already alluded to this during the interview, but just to be more specific, who can benefit and how from the PsychTable? And I mean, could it work as a sort of a database for academics, for if they want to retrieve some bibliographical references, for example, or if they want to go and look at what other people are doing in a more integrated way and things like that?
Absolutely. So the thing is, I think, in discussion with Dan and the rest of our team, we look at PsychTable benefiting a couple different segments of society, right? So, off the top of our heads, of course, the sort of first order beneficiaries who will directly benefit from it are researchers, scientists, right? And when we say researchers and scientists, of course, it's not only those who define themselves as evolutionary psychologists, but also they can be behavioral ecologists, they can be physical anthropologists, they can be, social neuroscience scientists, right? It could be an entire range of researchers and scientists globally who will not only use PsychTable as a database or a taxonomy, right, but also a way to look at gaps in the research that they can contribute to. For example, as I mentioned before, if I'm a researcher and I see an EPA that's on the table, and there's a lot of evidence that's been accumulated in, for example, the phylogenetic domain in cross-species domain, but not that many hunter-gatherer studies, then that might be a way for me to contribute to that body of knowledge, right? Then B, of course, to evaluate existing EPAs and showcase their own EPAs which they may be studying as part of the research programs for their laboratories, for example. Let's go ahead and put that on the classification table, right? And of course, there's educators as well, for professors who would like to teach their students, whether they're undergrads or below or above, about, hey, well, here's the entire, or at least part of the entire sort of panoply of the human mind, right? And here are the biological bases of that, and let's go ahead and explore this for our next exam or our quiz or whatever it might be. So they could be psychology professors, anthropology professors, whoever it might be, cognitive science. So educators, I think, can benefit from this as well. And then, of course, students, I ask all the students out there to use PsychTable to go ahead and look at opportunities to explore more. And finally, I guess the general public, especially those who are skeptical that we have an evolved human nature, right? And that our minds tend to be a blank slate. All right, I ask them to go ahead and look at the lines of evidence and draw their own conclusions about to what extent, our human nature is evolved, right? And the evidence for evolution that comes from beyond just typical natural selection and so on and so forth. It also helps, everyone learn a little bit more about what might not be evolved, right? Because not every phenomenon in the human mind is an adaptation, right? It could have arisen by genetic drift. It could have come through learning. It could have.
Sorry, we just lost you there. I thought I was going to have to jump in for you.
Oh, okay, all right. Where did that?
We got most of it. You were just wrapping up. I really love the idea of, like, a few years down the line, a high school student being able to log on, just go onto psychtable.org because they're doing a project on love, right? And they're able to look at the neurobiological evidence and the phylogenetic evidence that we have evolved different types of love, right? And the student can see all the evidence that's there, can see all the different scientific literature that sort of supports the fact that we have, this sort of bonding love, like between mother and child, right? Sort of oxytocin-mediated love, and we've also got the sort of romantic love, which really we use the same term, but it really has a kind of a different biochemical basis and a different function, and all these sorts of things. So that's what I like. I also like the idea, as been alluded to, of looking at different EPAs that are potential proposed EPAs that have not been well supported. And one that leaps out to me is the idea that we have evolved to encode different people's racial identities, different people's race, right? Now, this is one that has not fared so well in the literature, right? This was a, I guess, an intuitive idea at one time. You look at somebody and we have this immediate capacity to sort of encode like age and sex and status, perhaps. And somebody thought, well, maybe race too. Maybe we just look at them and say, okay, this is their race. Now, it turns out that's probably not true. In fact, what we might do instead is maybe encode their group affiliation, and race might be one of the ways in which we do that, but there's other ones. And so studies by Rob Kurzban a while back sort of showed that if you put people in yellow shirts and red shirts, then we don't even really notice their race anymore. We're automatically encoding their group affiliation along a different dimension, which is their shirt color, right? So that one study, I think, is pretty damaging to the proposal that we have a automatic racial encoding mechanism, right? And so things like that, I believe, are also important to put on the website, not as things that show up on our finished taxonomy, but let's look at the sort of the dustbin of science, if you will, right? These things have been proposed and discarded, and so scientists who want to study that can look at that dustbin and say either, oh, I shouldn't study that. All the evidence is really been there and not supported it, or they could say, it's not supported yet, but I'd like to try to propose a study that might salvage this from the dustbin. So that's sort of a few of the applications that I foresee.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So before we go, where are the best places on the internet for people to learn a little bit more about PsychTable and also about your own personal work?
Well, you can go ahead to the website itself. Dan and I have two papers up there. One of them was the initial sort of a proposed taxonomy of human evolved psychological adaptations that I wrote back in 2011. When I submitted that to the Journal of Social Evolutionary and Cultural Psychology, Dan was on the editorial committee, and that's how we became friends. And then we wrote another paper about a year afterward together, and I would encourage folks to go ahead and look at that paper that we wrote together. We have another paper coming out fairly soon. We'll announce it later on, I guess. But those are the two papers folks can read. I would also encourage folks to go to our websites if they like to learn a little bit more about our research and what we've been interested in, and how, I guess, human nature sort of is related to what we do, I guess you can say. So Dan and I come from two very different backgrounds, and I think our work in the social sciences, the evolutionary behavioral sciences, has informed a lot of our work, whether it's on policy formulation or in clinical psychology or whichever it might be. And then finally, I guess, I would also encourage folks to go ahead and look at Cosmides and Tooby's book, The Adapted Mind, in 1992. In fact, she has a prediction there. It was something along the lines of, just as one can now flip to Gray's Anatomy to any page and find an intricately detailed depiction of some of our species-typical morphology, we anticipate in 50 to 100 years that people will be able to pick up an equivalent reference work for psychology and find detailed descriptions of our evolved species-typical adaptations of the human mind. We didn't want to wait for 50 or 100 years, so we went ahead and started a couple of years ago. So now that it's going to be living online, and it's going to be accessible to the general public as well as to folks who are researchers and who'd like to be applicants for being curators, we're pretty excited about this next phase. And then finally, we have a GoFundMe page because we're crowdfunding that as well, and we'll be happy to give you a link that maybe you can help show on the interview video, Ricardo.
Yeah, see that would have been the perfect note to go out on. I'm gonna ruin that for a second to say that if you're interested in applications of the evolutionary behavioral sciences to practical domains like mental health or public policy or law or anything like that, Niruban and I are vice president and president respectively of the Applied Evolutionary Psychology Society, which you could find at apesociety.org. That's AEP society.org. So I encourage you to check that out if you're at all interested, and visit us online at psychtable.org. That's PSYCH table.org.
Okay, great. So I will be leaving links to all of that in the description box of the interview. And Dan and Niruban, it was really a pleasure to have you on the show, and maybe in the future we could do other episodes to talk about PsychTable, but more specifically about specific evolutionary psychological adaptations. So anyway, it was a pleasure to have you on, and thank you for taking the time.
Thank you so much. I'd love to.
Thank you very much, Ricardo.
Hi everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. If you don't like Patreon, you also have the alternatives of Subscribestar and PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of the video. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons: Karen Litske, Anne Blanchett, Perelga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantal Gelinas, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Gondreano, Jana Eninen, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, John Connors, Adam Castle, Vega Gidi, Doctors Jerry Muller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, and Bo Weingard, and also my 3 producers, Isar Webb, Rosie, and Jim Frank. Thank you for all.